Nobody wants that old wreck, they told her, and she was 34 years old with nothing left in the world but a mule, a carpet bag, and $9 sewn into a petticoat when she heard it. Delia Marsh had buried her husband that spring, lost their leased farmland to a creditor who had never liked her, and been turned away from her own sister's door in the town of Cutler's Bend because her brother-in-law said a widow with debts was bad luck under any roof. She walked 3 days along the river until she reached the settlement of Amity Crossing, Oregon Territory, in the autumn of 1879. And there, at the edge of a river bend where the current ran slow and silver-brown, she found an old ferry dock, abandoned since the flood of '74, its pilings gray and split, its landing planks rotted through, its ferry house collapsed on one side like a tired old man leaning on a cane. The county clerk sold it to her for $7 because no one else had ever asked, and the men at the mercantile laughed behind their hands and said she'd bought a wreck that would drown her the first spring flood. But beneath the dock's collapsed floor, sealed in a place the river itself had never managed to reach in 5 years of rotten ruin, waited something that would not only save her, but would quiet a grief the entire valley had carried without ever speaking its name. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Delia Marsh. If you have ever been told that what you're holding on to is worthless, we would love to hear about it in the comments below. Delia had been raised not along that river but along the Ohio, in a river town called Marsh's Landing, so named for her own grandfather, who had run one of the first flatboat crossings on that stretch of water before the railroads came and made such crossings less profitable, though never entirely obsolete. Her father, Samuel Marsh, had inherited that ferry trade and had raised Delia, his only surviving child after 2 infant sons were lost to cholera, less as a delicate daughter to be sheltered and more as an apprentice to be taught, because there was no son left to teach and because Samuel Marsh believed, in his quiet and unfashionable way, that a river did not care whether the hands that read it were a man's or a woman's, only whether they were skilled. From the time she was 8 years old, Delia learned to read a current the way other girls learn embroidery. She learned to judge by the color and the swell of the water where sandbar lay hidden beneath the surface, to know by the smell of the air and the behavior of the swallows when a storm was building upstream that would swell the river by nightfall, to splice a hawser rope so it would hold under strain, and to caulk a hull seam so tight that not even spring floodwater could find its way through. Her mother, Prudence, a quieter presence but no less formative, taught her the keeping of accounts, the running of a household on little, and above all the particular dignity of hospitality because the ferry house had always doubled as a way station for travelers, and Prudence Marsh believed that a tired stranger given a warm meal and a dry place to sleep would remember that kindness longer than he would remember the price of his crossing. Delia grew up, then, both riverwoman and innkeeper, capable of hauling a line in a squall and capable of setting a table with what little they had so that it looked like plenty. She was 17 when the newer railroad bridge finally rendered her family's ferry crossing unnecessary, and she watched her father age 10 years in the space of one autumn as the traffic that had sustained 3 generations of marshes simply stopped coming, the way water stopped flowing once you've dammed it upstream. Samuel Marsh did not complain, but something in him seemed to fold quietly inward after that. And though he lived another 8 years, doing a carpentry and small boat repairs to keep food on the table, Delia understood that she had watched a man's life's purpose be taken from him not through any fault of his own, but simply because the world had moved on and left his particular skill behind, unwanted. It was a lesson that lodged deep in her, one she would not fully understand the use of until decades later, standing at the edge of another abandoned dock in another river valley entirely. That a thing being unwanted by the present moment did not mean it had been without value, only that its moment of being needed again had not yet arrived. She married at 22, a steady, unremarkable, kind man named Everett Hale who worked as a wheelwright, and though it required leaving the river of her childhood, she did so willingly, because Everett's trade took them west, first in Missouri and then, by stages over 12 years, all the way to the Willamette Valley of Oregon, chasing the promise of good land that a man of modest means might actually be able to lease and eventually own outright. They had no children, a private sorrow Delia carried quietly and did not dwell upon aloud, but they had, in Everett, a genuine partnership, 13 years of it, built on the same quiet competence her parents had modeled for her mending wheels and wagon gear for the farms around Cutler's Bend, she keeping their small lease plot productive, and their household solvent through years when money was tight and the harvest uncertain. It was, by any measure that mattered to Delia, a good life, unspectacular but honest, and she had no reason to think it would not continue in that same steady way for decades more. 1878, not of any dramatic accident, but of a lung fever that settled into his chest during a wet November and simply never lifted. 3 months of slow decline that emptied their small savings into doctor's bills that ultimately changed nothing. Delia buried him in the churchyard at Cutler's Bend in February, and by April, the man who held a note on their leased land, a hard, unsentimental creditor named Joseph Kettering, who had never much cared for Everett and cared even less for a widow he considered a poor financial risk, called a debt due in full, aware that Delia had no way to pay it without selling off nearly everything she owned. She sold what she could, settled what portion of the debt she was able, and found herself, by early summer, with the land gone, the household dispersed, and only her sister Mary's household in Cutler's Bend itself remaining as a possible refuge. That refuge lasted less than 6 weeks. Mary's husband, a cautious, image-conscious man named Harlan Pruitt, who ran the town's feed store, grew increasingly uneasy at having what he called a debt-ridden widow under his roof, worried what the town would think of his own household's respectability, and eventually, gently but unmistakably, made clear through Mary that it would be best for everyone if Delia found her own arrangement. Mary cried when she said it. Delia did not, because she had learned long ago, watching her own father lose his purpose without complaint, that dignity was a thing you carried yourself, regardless of how others chose to treat you. She left Cutler's Bend in August of 1879 with a mule named Barnabas that Everett had left her, a carpetbag containing what remained of her clothing in a small tin box of keepsakes, and $9 sewn carefully into a waistband of a petticoat where no thief on the road could easily find it. She walked north along the river, not entirely certain of her destination, only certain that she needed distance from a town that had made its judgment of a plain, and it was on the 3rd day of that walk, footsore and increasingly aware that $9 would not sustain her indefinitely, that she came upon the settlement of Amity Crossing, a modest farming community strung along a bend in the river where the water ran wide and slow beneath low bluffs. She noticed the old ferry dock before she noticed almost anything else about the town, because a lifetime spent reading river crossings had trained her eye to see such structures the way another woman might notice a church steeple. It sat at the natural narrowing of the bend, exactly where a Compton ferry operator would have placed it, and it was unmistakably dead. The landing planks rotted through in a dozen places, the pilings gray and split from years of ice and flood. The small ferry house at the shore end collapsed on its northern side where a fallen cottonwood had crushed the roof some years back. She asked after it at the general store almost idly, more out of professional habit than any real plan, and the storekeeper, a garrulous man named Otto Reinhold, told her its history without much prompting. The dock had served Amity Crossing reasonably well for over a decade until the Great Flood of 1874 tore out its central pilings and drowned the ferry operator, a widower named Caleb Whitfield, who had gone out in the rising water to try to save his boat and simply never come back to shore. Since then, the county had done nothing with the wreckage, no one having the funds or the inclination to rebuild a crossing that a new toll bridge 8 miles upstream had rendered somewhat less essential, though Otto allowed that the bridge route added a considerable detour for farmers on the near side of the river who needed to reach the mill and the rail depot on the far bank. Delia asked, still more out of habit than intention, what such a property might cost, and Otto laughed, not unkindly, and said the county clerk would probably pay her to take it off the books, since it had sat unclaimed and untaxed for 5 years and nobody in their right mind would want that old wreck. It was that phrase, said so carelessly, that lodged in Delia's chest and would not leave her alone that night as she made camp near the riverbank, because she found herself thinking not of the wreck as a wreck, but as her father's ferry house had once been, before the railroad came, and something in her, perhaps grief, perhaps stubbornness, perhaps the simple accumulated instinct of a lifetime spent reading rivers told her that she was looking at a thing whose moment of being needed again might not be as far off as the town assumed. She visited the county clerk the following morning, a tired, overworked man named Findlay Ross who seemed genuinely startled that anyone wanted the property at all, and who quoted her a nominal price of $7 simply to clear the back taxes and transfer the deed, admitting frankly that he'd sooner see it in someone's hands and continue carrying it as dead weight on the county's books. Delia paid it from her dwindling $9, walked to the dock that same afternoon with Barnabas the mule and her carpetbag, and stood at the edge of the collapsed ferry house as the last of the day's light slanted gold across the water, aware that half the town had likely already heard, by supper that evening, that the widow woman had paid good money for Caleb Whitfield's old wreck, and aware, too, that she did not particularly care what they thought. The first days of actually working the property confirmed both the worst of what Otto had described and something he had not mentioned at all. The landing planks were indeed rotted through in most places, requiring careful stepping, and the pilings that remained were split and weakened by years of ice, though Delia's train I recognized, as it had once recognized the same in her father's dock, that not all of them were beyond saving 3 of the 6 main pilings, driven deep into a rocky riverbed, remained structurally sound beneath their weathered gray surface, and the ferry house itself, though collapsed on its northern side, had a southern half whose frame, when she examined it closely, was built of good oak that had simply been protected from the woes of the fallen tree's weight. What Otto had not mentioned, because it seemed the town itself had largely forgotten it, was that the ferry house had been built with a root cellar beneath its floor, a common enough feature for a way station that needed to keep provisions cool through summer months, and that this cellar, though its trapdoor was buried beneath 5 years of collapsed roofing debris, had apparently never fully flooded even during the disaster of 1874. Protected by its position on slightly higher ground at the rear of the structure. It took Delia the better part of 4 days, working alone with tools she found half buried in the wreckage and a small hatchet she carried from Cutler's Bend, to clear enough of the collapsed roofing to expose the cellar's trapdoor, and when she finally pried it open on the 5th morning, lowering herself down with a lantern borrowed from Otto Reinhold in exchange for a promise of fresh-caught fish once she had the ferry running again, she found the space dry, cool, and undisturbed in a way that made the hair on her arms rise, because it meant that whatever Caleb Whitfield had kept down there had waited, untouched, for exactly the person who would know to look for it. What she found was not treasure in any glittering sense, but something that would prove, in time, to matter a great deal more, a sturdy strong box, its lock rusted but it seemed still tight against the damp, and beside it, wrapped in oil canvas that had kept the worst of the years away, a bound ledger and a stack of correspondence tied with twine. She carried both up into the daylight and sat with them on the one solid section of dock flooring that remained, and it was there, prying the strong box open with a chisel borrowed from her own late husband's toolkit, that she found $83 in coin, a sum that would have been modest but respectable in any ordinary year, and tucked beneath the coins, a folded document that identified itself, in careful legal script, as a survey and water rights claim filed by Caleb Whitfield in 1871, 3 years before his death, granting him and his heirs the exclusive ferry and toll rights across that particular bend of the river for a term of 50 years, a claim that, so far as Delia could tell from the paper itself, had never been formally revoked or transferred to anyone else, simply abandoned by neglect after Whitfield's drowning left no obvious heir to press it. The ledger, when she read it that evening by lantern light in the one dry corner of the ferry house she'd managed to clear and shelter, told a story considerably more complicated than a simple drowning. Caleb Whitfield's careful, workman-like entries recorded not just his ferry receipts but a slow, patient dispute he had been waging in the 2 years before his death with a man named Aldous Chesney, who ran the mill on the far side of the river and who, the ledger made clear in Whitfield's own increasingly frustrated hand, had been pressuring the county for years to grant him control of the crossing rights so that he might build his own toll bridge upstream and eliminate the ferry's competition. Entirely, the correspondence, several letters between Whitfield and a land attorney in the county seat, reveal that Whitfield had refused to sell his water rights despite repeated offers, believing correctly that his 50-year claim gave him standing that Chesney could not simply purchase around, and the final letter in the stack, dated only weeks before the flood that killed him, warned Whitfield that Chesney had begun quietly lobbying the county commissioners to have the ferry's crossing designated a public hazard, which would allow the county to revoke Whitfield's rights on safety grounds and clear the way for Chesney's bridge regardless of the water rights claim. Delia sat with that final letter for a long while, feeling something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the evening chill coming off the river, because she understood, reading between the careful lines of an old dead man's correspondence, that Caleb Whitfield had died at the exact moment his dispute with Aldous Chesney was reaching its most dangerous point, drowned in a flood while trying to save the very boat whose continued operation stood between Chesney and unobstructed monopoly on river crossing in that valley. She did not know, that first night, whether Whitfield's death had been the accident everyone assumed or something the valley had simply been too willing to accept without questioning, but she knew enough of how towns worked, and enough of how her own father had been quietly erased from relevance by forces larger than himself, to understand that a 50-year water rights claim, still legally unexpired, sitting in the hands of a capable woman who knew exactly how to run a ferry crossing, was a thing that certain people in Amity Crossing would very much prefer stayed buried in a flooded cellar forever. The deeper Delia looked into the matter over the following weeks, quietly asking questions of the mercantile and the small county records office in town, without revealing quite how much he already knew, the clearer the shape of the old injustice became. Aldous Chesney had indeed built his toll bridge 8 miles upstream in 1875, less than a year after Whitfield's death, funded in part, according to Otto Reinhold's recollection, by a surprisingly generous loan from the county itself, arranged through commissioners who happened to be close business associates of Chesney's family. That bridge, while genuinely useful to travelers on the main road, added a considerable detour for the farms on the near side of the river directly across from Amity Crossing, farms whose owners had grumbled for 5 years about the inconvenience without ever quite connecting it to the old ferry's disappearance, because the story the town had settled on was simply that poor Caleb Whitfield had died in an unfortunate accident and his ferry had, sadly, gone down with him. Delia found herself wondering, and then quietly investigating, whether that settled story was entirely true, and a conversation with an elderly farmer named Nathaniel Poe, who had lived along the near bank his whole life and remembered the flood clearly, gave her the thread she needed. Poe recalled that on the night of the flood, Whitfield had told him he intended to move his boat to a safer mooring upstream because he'd received word that the county's floodgates further up the valley, which Chesney's own family partly controlled through their milling operation, had been opened earlier and more suddenly than the weather alone seemed to justify, sending an unexpected surge downriver that caught the ferry landing off guard in a way that a normal seasonal flood likely would not have. Nathaniel Poe could not say, and would not have wished to say even if he could, that Aldous Chesney had deliberately caused Caleb Whitfield's death, and Delia herself was careful never to make that specific accusation aloud to anyone, understanding that such a claim, unprovable after 5 years, would do her cause more harm than good and might well be considered slander of a dead man's memory besides. But what she could prove, with a water rights claim intact and a strong box and the county's own records confirming it had never been formally revoked, was something narrower and more useful, that she now held by inheritance of ownership through her legitimate $7 purchase of the property and its associated legal claims, the same 50-year ferry and toll rights that Caleb Whitfield had held, with over 40 years still remaining on the original term, and that this claim gave her every legal standing to rebuild and operate the crossing regardless of what arrangement the county had made with Aldous Chesney's bridge in the intervening years. It was Otto Reinhold, garrulous but not unkind, who first warned her plainly what she was walking into, telling her over the fish she'd promised him that Aldous Chesney was not a man who took kindly to competition, and that the county commissioners, several of whom owed favors to Chesney's family, would not welcome a widow showing up with an old dead man's paperwork to complicate an arrangement that had suited everyone comfortably for 5 years. Delia thanked him for the warning and continued anyway, because she had not walked 3 days from Cutler's Bend and spent her last $7 on a wreck merely to be frightened of it by the prospect of difficulty, and because something in her, the same something that had watched her father lose his purpose without a fight, had quietly resolved that she would not let the same thing happen twice under her own name. Aldous Chesney came to see her himself within the week, a broad, well-fed man in a good wool coat who arrived at the ferry landing with a particular smiling condescension of a man used to being deferred to, and he suggested, with what he clearly believed with generous patience, that Delia would do far better to sell him whatever old papers she'd found for a modest sum and move on to somewhere more suitable for a woman alone, rather than waste her time and money trying to rebuild a crossing that the valley had long since replaced with his own perfectly serviceable bridge. Delia listened to the entire speech without interrupting, and then told him, with the same level composure she had shown her sister's husband and every other person who had underestimated her that year, that she had not yet decided what to do with the ferry rights, but that she would certainly let him know once she had, and that in the meantime she intended to begin repairs immediately, as was entirely her legal privilege as the property's rightful owner. The pressure that followed was not violent, but it was thorough in the particular quiet way such pressure often is in small communities where one family's influence reaches into every transaction. The lumber mill, which Chesney partly controlled through family connections, suddenly found itself unable to spare mill planks for her repairs at any price she could afford. The county surveyor, when she requested he confirm her water rights boundary officially, found himself curiously delayed for weeks at a time. And Finlay Ross, the county clerk who had sold her property so readily, grew visibly uncomfortable whenever she came to ask further questions, eventually admitting under her patient, gentle questioning that he'd been quietly encouraged by two of the commissioners to find some technical defect in a deed that might allow the county to reclaim the property before she could establish her crossing as an operating concern. Delia understood, watching the same familiar machinery of quiet influence close around her, that if she wished to actually rebuild what Caleb Whitfield had lost, she would need more than an old strong box of coins and a faded legal claim. She would need proof solid enough that no commissioner beholden to Chesney could quietly make it disappear, and she would need it before the county found it pretext to void her deed entirely. She spent the remainder of that autumn pursuing exactly that proof with the same patient thoroughness her mother had taught her in the keeping of careful accounts. She wrote to the Territorial Land Office in Salem, enclosing copies of Whitfield's original water rights filing, and received back, after some weeks, official confirmation that the claim remained on record and unexpired, a document bearing a territorial seal that no county commissioner could simply wave away. She tracked down, through a combination of Nathaniel Post's memory and old newspaper notices Otto Reinhold helped her locate at the county seat, three other farmers on the near bank who confirmed independently that Whitfield had spoken, in the days before his death, of the floodgates having been opened earlier than the weather warranted, and while none of this proved deliberate wrongdoing, it built, entry by entry, the same kind of careful ledger of truth that Whitfield himself had once kept, a record that made plain the crossing's disappearance had never been the simple accident the valley had comfortably assumed. And she used the $83 from the strong box, along with careful negotiation with a small independent lumberyard 2 towns over that old Chesney no loyalty, to begin rebuilding the dock structure plank by plank, working alongside two of the nearbank farmers who had grown weary of the long D2 and were glad, once they understood her claim was legitimate, to lend their labor in exchange for future crossing privileges. By the time the county commissioners finally convened, at Chesney's evident urging, to formally review the validity of Delia's deed, she arrived at that meeting not as a lone widow with an old man's forgotten papers, but with the Territorial Land Office's sealed confirmation of her water rights, sworn statements from 3 respected farmers regarding the suspicious circumstances of the floodgates, a half-rebuilt dock that several of the county's own citizens had personally helped construct, and Otto Reinhold himself, whose standing in the community as a long-time merchant carried real weight, willing to speak plainly about what he'd observed of Chesney's efforts to obstruct her repairs. The commissioners, faced with proof that would embarrass them considerably if pressed further in a territorial court, found themselves with considerably less enthusiasm for revoking a deed they had sold legitimately for $7. And the matter were quietly resolved not through any dramatic public reckoning, but through the particular deflating way such matters often resolve when the powerful realize continuing to push will cost them more than backing away. Chesney's toll bridge continued to operate for those who preferred the main road, but Delia's ferry rights were formally and permanently confirmed, her deed left entirely undisturbed, and the county surveyor who had been so curiously delayed suddenly found time within the week to complete her boundary confirmation. Aldous Chesney faced no dramatic public disgrace, no arrest, no trial for whatever role he may or may not have played in the floodgates 5 years before, and Delia had never sought such a reckoning, understanding that some truths, once brought fully into the light of official record, punish a man simply by existing where he can no longer pretend they don't. What he did face, in the years that followed, was a slow, unglamorous erosion of a monopoly he'd assumed was permanent, as farmers on the near bank, freed from the long D2, chose Delia's rebuilt ferry for the shorter crossing whenever the season allowed it, and as the story of the widow who'd rebuilt Caleb Whitfield's old wreck circulated through the valley in the particular way such stories do, quietly shifting who the community trusted and whose good opinion it sought. By the following spring, the ferry dock that Otto Reinhold had once dismissed as a wreck nobody wanted stood rebuilt on its 3 sound original pilings and 3 new ones milled from the independent lumberyard, its ferry house repaired with good oak salvaged from the structure's own undamaged southern half, and Delia Hale, as she still signed a name though she had buried the man who gave it to her, ran it herself, competent and unhurried, exactly as her father had once run his own crossing on the Ohio before a railroad made his skills briefly, temporarily unwanted. She kept, in a small cedar box on a shelf near the ferry house door, the strong bags that had held Caleb Whitfield's coins, empty now but preserved, and the ledger in which he had recorded both his careful receipts and his quiet, unheeded warnings, because she had come to understand that his story and her own were, in the end, the same story. A person whose worth the world had briefly and mistakenly decided it no longer needed, waiting patiently for the moment that decision would prove itself wrong. And so we returned to where we began, To a widow with $9 and a mule standing at the edge of a collapsed dock that an entire valley had agreed was worthless. To the $7 she paid for a wreck nobody wanted. To the cellar beneath its floor where an old ferryman's Kafel hope had waited 5 years for someone patient enough to climb down and look. Delia Marshall never forgot what it felt like to be told her presence was inconvenient. First by a creditor who saw only a debt, then by a brother-in-law who saw only a risk to his own respectability. But she came to understand, standing at last on a dock she had rebuilt with her own hands, that being unwanted in one moment was never the same as being without value, only a matter of the world not yet recognizing what it would eventually need again. The wreck that made the whole town laugh in August became, by the following spring, the crossing that farmers on both banks depended upon in the valley quietly came to respect, and Delia, who had arrived with nothing but a strong back's key she didn't yet know she'd need, found she had become, without ever intending the transformation, precisely the kind of steady, capable presence her own father had once been to a river that needed him. Thank you for spending this time with Delia and with us tonight. If her story moved you, we would be glad if you pass it along to someone who needs reminding that being called a fool by people who don't understand your worth is not the same as actually being foolish. We would love to know, in the comments below, about a time in your own life when you found real value in something, or in yourself, that others had already written off. We read everyone, and we treasure hearing which parts of these stories linger with you. Until next time, stay close.